and everything. If anyone has any issues, looks like everyone is good. Okay. Well, thank you again. Thank you so much for being with us, Allan. Allan D. Hunter lived in New Mexico from 1973 to 1984 before emigrating to New York to become a gender activist. He received a degree in women's studies and a graduate degrees in sociology and social work, and worked with psychiatric patients' right groups and gender identity support groups. He later served as an elder abuse caseworker in the Bronx. His truncated academic career included publication of a short but groundbreaking theory piece, Same Door, Different Closet, a heterosexual sissies coming out party, in a peer-reviewed journal, Feminism and Psychology. The original manuscript for this book received an award in a Cisco Writers Club competition. This evening, we will hear about Hunter's new book, Genderqueer, A Story from a Different Closet, a genderqueer coming of age and coming out story from an era long before genderqueer was trending. Please welcome Allan Hunter. Oh, Allan, make sure you're unmuted.
Hi, there we go. I think I would have done this often enough to remember to do that. Anyway, thanks for coming. This is Genderqueer, my book, which was finally published in just this spring, March of 2020. I've been trying to get it into print since about 2013. This is about the fourth publisher that was on the verge of publishing it. For one reason or another, it misfired several times with different publishers, but I finally succeeded in getting out. What I'm going to do tonight, I'm going to read from the third portion of the book. The book is divided up into roughly 3 equal parts. The third portion is called Back to University. And it's sort of the part of the book where things really started coming together for me. And I was able to formulate an identity that no one had ever spoken of. It didn't quite resemble anything I had ever heard of, but which enabled me to make sense of this rather odd life I had lived. The portions I'm going to read aren't entirely contiguous. I'm going to be reading them in such a way that they're in the same order that they occur in the book, but I'm going to sort of dip and skip in such a way that will allow me to focus on some elements that will tie directly into the lecture that's to follow. Derek, that's the main character, which is me, since it's autobiographical, had grown up being a boy who is more like one of the girls. And he's been picked on and harassed for that sometimes. But he grew up alongside of the women's liberation movement, which had said that it was sexist and wrong to have different expectations. And so Derek dismissed all those concerns that other people voiced as being stupid and irrelevant. But as he got older and hit dating age, things became complicated. He doesn't fit in and he gets left out. And being left out of dating and romance is making him very unhappy. I picked up a book at the school bookstore about self-discovery. It was a workbook, not a text. There were lots of exercises to do and questions you were supposed to answer about yourself. I flipped through it and read enough of it to feel an affinity for how it was written, so I bought it. Back in my dorm room, I began doing some of the exercises, writing a poem for myself as I was now to the person I had been at certain earlier ages, picking my favorite colors from color swatches, and then answering follow-up questions about what I liked about those colors. The booklet wasn't designed to give you back any conclusions, really, so much as to prompt you to think about yourself in new and different ways. The self-help book I'd bought had a pretty extensive section on sexual and gender identity. There were a lot of questions about how you had viewed yourself back when you were a kid, and about your own sex, and about the opposite sex, and so forth. As I answered the questions and jotted down things from my remembered experiences and circled the statements that seemed most true, it really hit me that it was significant that I had been extremely girl identified as a child. I don't mean I'd never noticed it before. It was more the opposite. I'd always known this about myself and took it for granted. Now, all of a sudden, it seemed huge. It wasn't a difference like the way that being left-handed was difference, or the way that having eyes of two different colors was a difference. For years and years, I had wanted to be like the girls, to be perceived as being like them, to be accepted by them, to compete with them as an equal. It wasn't just some interesting but innocuous bit of personal history. It had to have shaped how I grew up inside my head. I'd sort of tried to set that aside when I thought I would fit in as one of the long-haired, pot-smoking countercultural guys, but that hadn't really worked. I'd still been too much like a girl to fit in and be accepted there. I must have been different to start with, to have had that inclination, to have wanted to be like the girls in the first place. Wow, I wondered, what does this make me now? What am I? Derek checks out some books written by transsexual women. That was the word in use back then, by the way. The author's descriptions of themselves growing up sound to Derek a lot like his own experience. It doesn't exactly put him at ease. I was not at peace. My mind was scurrying around like a squirrel in a cage, repeating the same little thought loops and basically getting nowhere. The gender and sexual identity questions were compelling, and I couldn't leave them alone, going back to them perpetually like a tongue seeking out a sore tooth. But at the same time, I was uncomfortable thinking about it for long. Being like a girl inside instead of like other boys made me just as different as being gay would have. The experiences described by the transsexual authors were eerily similar to my own in so many ways, and yet ultimately, the path for them had been to decide that the male body they were born with was wrong for them. Did I want a sex change operation? Seriously? If I were female, if I were a girl, a woman, well, it was hardly as if at that point people would cease to assume I probably wanted to have sex with guys, if you see what I mean. I wouldn't have to, no matter what everyone thought. I could be, well, a lesbian. So I'd be getting a sex change operation in order to have sex with females as a lesbian? Yeah, now there's a course of action I'm sure everyone would recognize as eminently logical. It would be horribly lonely. I'd not just be a lesbian, I'd be a lesbian with no past. I'd have to disown who I had been all my life up until then, unless I was lucky enough to find a lesbian partner who could love me as a transsexual person and not be freaked out knowing that I'd been male, not be weirded out knowing that my female parts were surgically created. And if there were such a lesbian person out there, with that much openness and acceptance of weirdness and difference, would she really reject me the same me if I were still male? With my luck, if I did this, I would then meet a woman who really liked me and would want to share and talk and love, and she'd be attracted to male bodies, and there I would be in a surgically modified body and wishing I had the old one back. And would I miss it anyhow? Did my male body seem all wrong to me? Did I hate being male? What did I think of my body, really? A memory came back to me of striding across the junior high campus lawn on my way home. The sun had been shining and my shadow was cast upon the ground, and I'd glanced down at my shadow shape and felt good. I felt pretty. Look at me. I look the perfect way for a guy to look. I have nice shapes and I move nicely. It was still true. I really did like my own appearance. I did not want to look like some other guy, some movie star, some athlete. I have a skinny upper body with a shallow chest. Good. I want it that way. I really like my face. Small, taut waist, tiny, taut ass. Damn right. I was so glad my body had not broadened and become like so many adult bodies. It was almost like a child's body at waist and hips. I liked it that way. Then curvy, muscular legs. My legs as curvy as any girl's. All that hiking and walking. So yes, I was vain. Really, I do like my body. Okay, but what about the male bits? Is that all wrong? I don't know. Penis. Silly part. I do like the way it feels, but I don't feel cute for having one or think mine is nice looking. I don't know. It's just kind of there, you know? To be female instead. I think I'd hate having big breasts, maybe tiny, cute, perky ones. I thought about female bodies as if I were shopping for one to be inside of. Hmm, freckles. I want freckles and dark hair and a nice smile, small tits, medium tall, definitely not short. Curvy down below, but not too wide. And girl parts, of course, a cunt, my own perfect perky V shape with a nice mons. Wow. Bloody hell. I never bothered leaving the room. Okay, ignoring that. I would try being female if I ever got the chance. Yes, I would. And you know something? I think I would be good at it. I think I would be a good female person. And yeah, actually, I really, really wish I had the chance to try that out. It would be fun, and people would see me a lot more the way I see myself, I think. But seriously, my existing body is not the problem. The next thing that fell into place for me was the women's liberation movement, feminism. I was standing there on the front porch, and it hit me, this vivid image of an intense woman at the podium, her voice snapping like a whip, talking to the audience about the unfairness of sexual expectations, that when men do it, it's assertive, taking charge, showing initiative. Oh, but when women do it, oh, now it's pushy. She's being domineering. She's a bitch. Well, fuck that shit, she says. The audience of feminist women cheer and raise their clenched fist in a salute. Oh, yeah, feminists. Sure, they had talked about the double standard. How, if it was okay for men to be sexually assertive and be admired for their sexual activities and proficiencies, then it should be okay for women to be sexually assertive about their interests and appetites. If sexually active men were admirable, sexually active women should be similarly admired instead of being demeaned as sluts and so forth. By the time school resumes in January, Derek has come out. He doesn't know what to call his identity yet, but he knows he's neither gay nor trans. It's something else. He's definitely one of the girls. His body is male, and he's attracted to female folks. He takes a course about human sexuality and signs up to be one of the guest speakers when the professor asks if anyone wants to. I'd been seated between two gay guys during our presentation. Raphael, now standing to my left, had introduced himself as a militant faggot who was as masculine as any straight guy. He had really taken on the audience, challenging them and practically inviting anyone who had a problem with gay people to say so to his face. I wanted to say something to him. This was my first time feeling like I was among allies when I was with gay guys. I'd never tried to talk with them about this stuff, and now I wanted to. I felt awkward. I spoke to Joel. I think what you talked about, coming out to your friends and all, that's what many of my friends thought I was going to do. I started. Joel glanced back. Huh? What's that now? I mean, they could tell I was going through something like that. And I think they figured sooner or later I was going to come out as gay. I'm pretty sure several people were trying to tell me it was okay and that they were supportive. He smiled and looked at me, appraisingly, it seemed. Oh, I definitely had people who were like, oh, honey, you don't think you're telling me anything I don't already know. I had to get to the point where I was ready first. Raphael had apparently been tuning us in. He spoke from behind me. So, what's your thing now? You just want to make sure everyone knows you're not gay. That's it, right? It's a little different than that. I'm a lot like a girl. Effectively, that's who I am. And people tend to think that that's what it means if you're like that, is that you're gay. All right. God forbid anyone should think that. So you have to tell everyone you're horribly mistreated and it's not fair. People assuming you're gay. Raphael stuck his hands in his pockets and stared at me, not very warmly. People sometimes assume I'm straight. You think that's never uncomfortable? What's the big deal? Why you feel like you got to get up in front of everyone and correct them like that? Joel interposed himself. Hey, go easy. It takes courage to tell your personal stuff in public. I thought he had some interesting points about masculinity and femininity and sexual orientation. I gave him a grateful glance and smile, but addressed Raphael. Well, what are your reasons for wanting to speak out? It's not an equal situation. I could go out those doors and find 6 guys waiting to beat the shit out of me, and the police would say it was my fault. I've been beaten up several times for being a sissy, for acting too much like a girl. They thought I was you. Apparently, homophobia is more of an equal opportunity experience than you realize. And while we're at it, I know what you mean about being blamed for it and treated like I brought it on myself. I get that too. Joel said, I don't think we need to be all us versus them here. That's what's wrong with the world. Everyone going around hating people who aren't the same. We're all affected by the hate, not just those it's mainly aimed at. Raphael nodded, conceding. I'm just busting your chops a little. If you've been gay bashed, you understand why we've got to stop that. And it happens all the time, all over. I'm just saying you don't need to be denying you're not us. Straight people don't need to come out as straight. It's the default. You never hear of anyone coming out to their family, hey mom, hey dad, I got to tell you something, I'm straight. Well, you were denying being a sissy, I retorted. Seems to me that masculine is the default if you're male. I saw that I'd caught him from an unexpected angle. I continued more softly, and I did come out to my parents. It got into my head that maybe they'd assumed I was gay. I mean, they never gave me a lot of shit about being a sissy boy, and we never talked about it. For real? How'd that go over? I thought back to that conversation that day after dinner. Well, they seemed a little relieved, but also really uncomfortable, like they wanted to change the subject. I told them it was something else. I said, doing air quotes, but they didn't ask any questions. For all they knew, I might have decided I needed a sex change operation, you know? But they were just, oh no, son, we didn't think you were gay. And they ignored the rest. And I couldn't tell if it was totally something they never thought about or if they'd wondered about it sometime. Interesting. Hey, there's someone I think maybe you should meet. Raphael glanced at Joel and favored him with a raised eyebrow. Joel, you've met Michelle, right? Hell, I didn't even realize these guys already knew each other. Joel's face dawned into amusement. Oh yeah. Michelle would want to meet you, Raphael stated, still eyeball conferencing with Joel about it. They're finding something very entertaining. Care to clue me in? Raphael seemed to be enjoying my exasperation. Michelle's mom still says Mitchell, he finally told me, relenting. Oh, he's a transsexual then? That's cool. Don't say he, it's she, Raphael corrected. I'll talk to you after class, Thursday. I need to ask her, but I think you should meet. I met Michelle at the Frontier restaurant, following in Raphael's wake to the checkered booth seat across from her at her table. I actually had a hard time believing Raphael was not mistaken, that yes, this person was technically, from a biologically essentialist perspective, born male. I guess I'd been expecting a sultry, vampy, overly made up sex vixen with heavy lipsticks and high heels and fishnet hose and pointy bra cups and fluttery false eyelashes. The person I was introduced to was compact, wore no discernible makeup, had short page boy hair, was wearing a pair of pants that, although probably marketed as women's pants, were not overtly sexy and the top with harlequin diamond patchwork vest and no prominent boobs, and sneakers. Not flirtatious, straight, head on, meet your eyes, matter of fact kind of person. Yeah, I believe you. I don't have to remind myself to think of you as she. You just are. This is Derek, Raphael said, indicating me with a tilt of his head. I told you about him for my college sex studies class. You two got some things in common, and he hasn't met anyone he thinks of as being like him. Michelle glanced at me casually, momentarily, reserved, hard to read. So, Raphael continued, I'm going to head off for now and leave you two to discuss pantyhose or whatever turns you on. See you later. He abandoned us to any awkwardness or ease we might establish. I wanted conversation. To hell with awkwardness. I only read about being transsexual for the first time last fall. I mean, I vaguely remember hearing about it before that, but I checked out books written by transsexual authors and read them. Michelle gave me a direct, blue-eyed gaze and then did a nose-to-toes glance. Well, you're nice and slender, and you have a good face. You're tall, but that won't hurt anything. But I think people would probably notice the facial hair. She scrunched up her nose as in a wrinkle of distaste, but I sensed amusement and the implicit question mark there. I don't think of myself as female. I'm not. I'm a girl. That's my gender. But I'm male. That's my sex. Neither one is wrong. He may have a hard time convincing other people of that. No shit. Michelle furrowed her brows, looked down at the laminated table. Back. I wanted a figure. Curves. I couldn't look in a mirror and see the sex I was born, not without hating it for telling a lie. It was lying to everyone about who I am. It was lying to them. It was lying to me. That body was a lie. I'm telling the truth now about who I am. Do you believe that? About you? Absolutely. Or do you mean me and my body? Hmm. My turn to contemplate the Western motif designs in the tabletop. Am I falsely advertising as a boy person? No, not my fault. I really am a male person. People read that wrong as meaning I'm a boy person. I returned my eyes to Michelle's. I didn't choose this body, but it's authentically the one I came with. It doesn't say I'm a boy, but people make that assumption. That's their error, though, not my lie. Who would you want to touch it? Don't you crave someone's hands on you sometime? Will the person with those hands want to touch you in that body? I'm not sure. I haven't had enough experience. And I wonder about that too. She might like male bodies or she might like female bodies. If I change to have a female body, I might meet one who prefers male bodies. She, I see. That does complicate things. Yeah, tell me about it. I'm male. I'm a girl. I'm attracted to female people. What does that make me? A lesbian in a male body? Ugh, don't say that. Seriously, lesbian women have heard that before and they'll tell you it's offensive. You aren't going to win them over with that line. You like them? Lesbians, I mean? I like the ones I've met. And I think I'd like, would maybe like seriously butch lesbian feminists if, I don't know, maybe if some of them like male bodies but don't like men, you know? They don't like people like me. You aren't a real woman. You're a spy for the patriarchy. Get away, get out of here. I don't know why you think they'd like you any better. Why would you want to be with them anyway? They're a hateful bunch of bitches. I don't know for sure. I'm just saying there may be some chemistry. I like radical feminism. I grew up with it, and it's always said to me that I wasn't wrong or crazy. Now that I figured out a lot of stuff for myself, it seems to fit right in. Anyway, yeah, they're angry. I can see why, but some of them might like someone like me. Good luck with that, Michelle said, waving the idea away with her left hand. Then she looked at me again. I don't know, she added more thoughtfully. Maybe some would. Okay, those are my selected excerpts. So looking back, around the time that I came out, which was spring of 1980, by the way, the traditional notion of what it meant to be a trans woman, people didn't think of it as a particularly political thing so much as a medical thing. And the assumption was that if you had this difference, if you had been born this way, that what you did about it was that you transitioned, you sought out hormones, you worked with psychiatrists and with the doctors who could do these kinds of operations, and you had to convince them that you were an appropriate candidate, that you were serious about this, that you were well-adjusted, which generally meant that you embraced every aspect of the most stereotyped notions of femininity, hook, line, and sinker, with great enthusiasm. And then you did transition your body medically, at which point your sex and your gender matched, and all was well. Skip forward to the current era. We have a much larger umbrella inclusive notion of what it means to be trans, where you'll be told that anyone whose gender identity does not match the identity marked down by their mom's obstetrician on their birth certificate qualifies as trans. So you'll run into many people that will tell you that you are legitimate in your gender identity as a trans person, regardless of whether you have chosen to have an operation, regardless of whether or not you've chosen to receive hormones, or for that matter, whether you have the medical or the financial opportunity to do those things, that your gender identity is in fact valid, regardless of whether or not you pass, whether you're perceived by other people as having a sex that matches your identity. But having said all that, all of our modern era notions of what being trans is all about are still very much in the shadow of its own past. Fundamentally, if a person is understood to be a transgender woman, we still have the notion that it would be very impolite to think of them as anything other than female. And we have the notion that transgender women do not want to be distinguished from cisgender women, and that they want to be perceived and to have all of the experiences available to cisgender women, for them to be indistinguishable from cisgender women. People who identify as non-binary or genderqueer, as I do, on the other hand, may not intend to be perceived as female. In my case, rather specifically, I consider myself to have a sex which is not the one that typically matches my gender. And I don't consider either of those things wrong and to be in need of fixing. And far from it merely not delegitimizing my gender identity, if I fail to pass as female, I have no intention of passing. I want to be very much in your face to the world that has told me all my life that we perceive you to be male, and who you are is entirely wrong. You're not doing it right, because I've been made to feel like this is something I cannot possibly be proud of. I could not possibly accept this about myself. And I've always liked this about myself. I've never been ashamed of it. It's just I've seldom had the opportunity to say in so many words that I'm proud of it, until I finally lost my temper about it in 1980 and decided I'm not going to just respond to other people making an issue of it. I've had it up to here. Now I'm making an issue of it. Lots of people who identify as genderqueer do so in a way that's not identical to my own story. Genderqueer itself is a bit of an umbrella term. It brings together people who identify as, for example, gender fluid, who may vary from identifying as a guy some of the time, a gal some of the time, whether it's having boy days and girl days all within the same week, or having oscillations that take place over months or years even, or they may be fluid, not between a man or masculine gender and a woman or feminine gender, but through other possibilities. There may be people who consider themselves to be sometimes girls or women, and at other times to be genderless. There are also people who identify as genderqueer who consider themselves to be agender permanently. That gender just completely doesn't apply to them. So I consider my specific form of genderqueer to be gender inversion. I do use the term male to refer to my physical morphology. I consider it to be a good word to use to reference the physical, because we have everything from the little plug-ins of computer devices where they plug into a receptacle are considered male if they're the part that goes inside of the other part. The couplings on garden hoses, and so forth. We have this language of male and female to refer much more specifically to the physical. And we have plenty of other words such as masculine and feminine, boy and girl, man and woman, guy and gal, that refer to gender. But this is not a universal utilization of language either. And many people in the transgender community will also use male and female to refer essentially to identity, which is not consistent with how I'm using it tonight. Now, for all of the reasons that I highlighted, both in the pieces that I read and in my overview of where trans people's heads were at in 1980 at the time I came out, I did not find my best resonating connection with the transgender people, transsexual people, back then they called themselves, but rather instead with feminism. Within feminism, the activist women were saying that separating gender from sex meant separating what you were given at birth from what it was assumed to mean, so that those assumptions could be more easily challenged. So feminism had this very specific no double standard message that if anything was a good quality, it was a good quality regardless if you were male or female. And if it had been often regarded as an affirmative positive quality among males, but they as female people had gotten a lot of pushback for exhibiting those same characteristics, that here was a welcome mat saying, no, they're wrong. It is good for you to be this way if these are good characteristics to have. Well, on the surface, this becomes a message that's very, let's say, pro-androgyny. It's sort of holding the notion of gender in abeyance, that the notion that people are different from people in any meaningful way, that it's just composed entirely of ideology and stereotypes and generalizations with a lot of nasty attitudes to people that don't conform. But having said that, feminism quickly became a home to some women who were not merely androgynous, but rather blatantly butch. On the assumption made often by the butch women themselves and also about others who were just affirming their right to exist was that such people were lesbian. Because although it was, no one was saying that you had to have butch characteristics or that all lesbians automatically did, um, when you ran into people and they were being very assertive and very proud about their butchness, it was considered to be coterminous with the expression of their sexual orientation. Among male nonconformists, sexual nonconformists, there wasn't a similar phenomenon to feminism, but there was the parallel notion of male people who were considered and acknowledged to be male people, but who were also seen as femme, or another word you might have heard is Nelly, exhibiting characteristics that in female people were called feminine. And this also existed as its own identity within the gay male community. But again, it was the assumption that if you exhibited these characteristics, that the characteristics themselves are an expression of being gay. And I've heard many gay people doing, for example, comedy routines and talking about how they had always known and recalling their childhood and say, well, yeah, I always knew. And then they would go and recount their love for sequins and ballet and things that are associated with female people. Again, making it so it's coterminous, the femininity and the sexual orientation. Feminism, as I said, doesn't really directly address gender except to sort of look at it in askance and throw a lot of dubiety on it. And a lot of people who look at genderqueer and transgender and other gender activists who are promoting themselves as being differently gendered will often ask, why do you do that? And why is it necessary for you to do that? Why can't you just be a male who's comfortable with your feminine side or a male who doesn't buy into all of these stereotypical patriarchal notions of masculinity? Why do you need to call yourself a girl or a woman and identify as being differently gendered? So I want to talk about androgyny for a moment and the limitations of androgyny. Because this is actually kind of a complicated question. Let's say you happen to be a male person whose attributes and behavioral patterns and whatnot overlap a whole lot better with the ones that are assumed and attributed to female people than the ones that are assumed of male folks. And let's say you happen to live in a world where some, but not all, of the people in that world agree that it's sexist stereotyping to expect male people to be one way and female people to be a different way. But there are other people who also inhabit your world who believe that those so-called sexist stereotypes are actually legitimate, accurate descriptions about built-in differences between the sexes. The male children who grow up disbelieving in sexist stereotypes are obviously less likely to hold themselves up against those stereotypes and aspire to them and conform to them. So on average, they're probably going to be pretty androgynous. The male children who grow up embracing those sex polarized notions, on the other hand, are more likely to put some effort into manifesting masculinity. So now imagine that there's a room full of people, some with one set of expectations and beliefs, and some with the other attitudes. And they know about each other, of course. So into this room walks a male person, a stranger that none of them know yet. What expectations and anticipations get projected onto this male stranger? It's a blend, right? The ones who don't consider the traditional beliefs to be stereotypes will expect somewhat conventional masculine behavior. Oh, they may also have some space in their head for anticipating more androgynous behavior because they're aware of those other folks. The ones who discount that stuff as sexist stereotyping, so whether they approve of it or not, they may at least anticipate that this guy who just walked in might be one of those metrosexual androgynous types you see so often these days. How about the people in the room who don't ascribe to sexist assumptions? They're going to anticipate fairly neutral behavior from this male stranger, not materially different from what they'd anticipate if it were a female stranger, because they're not sexist jerks, right? Well, except that they're well aware of the continued existence of people who still subscribe to that stuff and believe it to be true. So, whether they approve of it or not, they have some room within their expectations that the guy walking in may be one of those, and hence may exhibit a lot of internalized, prescribed masculine signals and gender conformist attitudes. So if you average all that mess out, you get a midpoint, sort of halfway between conventionally, stereotypically masculine and androgynously unisex. And if this male stranger just so happens, in fact, to mostly have traits that overlap with the expectations and belief foisted onto female people, that collective expectation is going to be rather wrong, significantly wrong. So what is gained by asserting an identity as femme, as a male girl, as a feminine, not merely androgynously unisex male? It's a political act. It puts an entirely new expectation on the board. If we can establish an awareness on the part of those people in that room that I described, an awareness that some male people exhibit feminine traits, think of themselves as being feminine, embrace that, express that, then whether the people in that room approve of it or not, the fact that the possibility of us has been planted in their minds means that the expectations projected onto that male stranger will be shifted in our direction. I also want to point out that although we mostly think of gender as being all about what you shouldn't do, how you shouldn't be, gender isn't solely about constraints. For any given gender, we have role models, we have heroes and social icons who have demonstrated a capability or attained something, and these can be powerful to draw on. Gender can be about these strengths, about what a person of a given gender can do, and sometimes those are things that can even seem to step beyond the limitations of what we think a generic person can do. Or a way of being in the world, a set of characteristics that are most easily comprehended by referencing their widely shared popularization as associated with a specific kind of person of a specific gender. Now, a person may embrace these libraries of potentials and strengths and other admirable traits and all these nuances and stuff as elements of a gender that they participate in. Now, maybe a neutral, genderless notion of a person ought to be able to reference all of those same images and portrayals, all of those strengths, those libraries of human possibilities. But if our myths and stories and the portrayals of all the characters we know from books and films are embedded in a gendered world, trying to evoke them without evoking the gender that they're most associated with can be kind of like trying to think about how rose petals feel without conjuring up how they look or how they smell. Okay, I want to switch down to question and answer and get some feedback.
Great. Thank you so much, Allan. Our first question we have, and if anyone has any questions, please write them in the chat or the Q&A and we can answer them now. The first one we have is an interesting one. So, if by some magic society, we're able to totally do away with all gender stereotypes and expectations, would the entire issue of transgender and or genderqueer become less necessary?
I suspect it would. You've just heard me talk about getting things out of gender that were positive. But I'm a person who is gendered, whether that's a good thing or a not so good thing is sometimes irrelevant because whether good or bad, it happened to me. I reacted to a gendered world in a certain pattern by embracing an identity that probably does have limitations as well as things that I found very liberating and empowering. More to the point, though, if we had no notions about how male-bodied people and female-bodied people are different, then our notions of gender would be, after a few generations, would just sort of be floating around as notions about how people can be. And there's no reason to assume that they would retain the same sense of being two ends of a polarized magnet. And I think it would be increasingly hard to think of them as anything other than a sort of picnic basket of different traits that human beings happen to have, and it wouldn't be much different than we have introverts and we have extroverts, or we have party animals and we have loquacious people and we have introspective people, and those are not particularly gendered. The one way in which, well, there's really two ways in which it wouldn't necessarily go away even if we didn't continue to have stereotypes. One is that which was spoken of by the transgender activist Julia Serrano, who talks about brain sex. What Julia is talking about is not gender in the sense that I've described it, but is actually like a wiring diagram in the brain that says I'm supposed to have these physical parts. Julia says this is a different thing than gender. It's got nothing to do with your love for ballet or your skills in the kitchen or whether you can fix a V8 engine in your garage or whatever. It's strictly a sense of your brain expects you to have a body of a certain sort and yet doesn't. I'm not saying that this is accurate, but it's certainly a possibility, and I don't know it to not be the case. It's also been widely suggested that although people like me certainly exist, that if you look at the population of males and the population of females as two separate populations, even though there's a lot of variation in the population of males and similarly a lot of variation in the population of females, that the two populations are slightly offset from each other, that there are differences between the sexes at the generalization level. I actually suspect that is true, because if it's not true, we've got some very pervasive stereotypes that have hung on for a very long time. And maybe patriarchy by itself is not sufficient to have gotten that, to be established that in such a deep-rooted fashion. If that is the case, then it might continue to exist the observation that there is this mild difference between the two populations. But if you didn't have the rigid stereotypes, you wouldn't have the nasty prescriptive attitude of ought to be's and the hatred for those of us who are exceptions to the general rule.
Thank you, Allan. Our next question is, what surprises have you encountered with partners or potential partners as you shared your identity?
Through most of my life, since figuring it out and coming out, I guess you could say I've used it as a screening mechanism as well as a spotlight for looking for someone who would want to be with somebody like me. But I got involved with a person to whom I had made these things pretty I'd been very overt in describing myself in this fashion and had given some background about it. And she seemed very accepting of that. And as time went on, how to describe this? She became less and less enchanted with me as a partner and seemed to feel that I was just sort of her lot in life and that she couldn't get anybody any better. But she said and behaved in certain ways that gave me the impression that she didn't think very highly of the characteristics that I was actually very comfortable having, and thought that I should be different from that. And then in conversation, she said, "I just thought you made all that stuff up to make yourself sound interesting." And that she actually hadn't taken it very seriously. More recently, I had a partner who became a bit unnerved when I showed up on a date a few times wearing skirt. And she said, "Yeah, I knew this, but now it's like you're making me think about it all the time, and it's just not sexy for me to be with you. It's not something I'm comfortable with."
Thank you for sharing that, Allan. What was it like to grow up in New Mexico? Were your peers kind to who you are?
In the first third of the book in particular, in junior high school and high school, there was a lot of very overt hostility and contempt, and a fair amount of violence. The older I got, the less of that I had to deal with. People might still think things that weren't very flattering, but they were less likely to voice them. There's something about being an 8th grader that seems to just bring out a person's willingness to say the most hostile things. By the last third of the book, when I'm in a university setting, most of the behaviors I got from people were pretty welcoming and accepting. People were trying their best to make me feel like who I was okay with them. It didn't make things a whole lot more comfortable for me, because the person they thought they were accepting in this fashion was a gay guy. And some people were a little bit more inclined to mock me and ridicule me along the lines of, you'll find the world will accept you as soon as you're ready to accept yourself. When are you going to come out? I've never been in a position where the majority of people understood me for who I am and accepted me as such, which is why I wrote the book. It's still not an identity that's out there. And until it's something people have read about and seen portrayed in movies and books and so on, they're not likely to come up with it on their own just from observing someone's behavior.
Okay. This question, okay. There's a lot of focus on pronouns right now. How do you feel about this proposal about the proposal of a pronoun? V has been suggested, which simply means person with no gender identity necessary. I lived through the start of Miss, which I can mean all women. Sorry, I'm butchering this, without identifying as married or single. But if I want to emphasize being married, I'm free to call myself Miss. What?
Mrs. No.
Yeah. What if there were a gender neutral, inclusive pronoun for everyone, with people free to choose to use a gender specific word if they wanted? I hope I'm.
That sounds like a good idea to me. I kind of came along before the great pronoun revolution, and that is an idea that did not come spontaneously to my own head. I never created one for myself. My own problem with pronouns is, even with all of the interesting complexity that they enable us to deal with, there's no pronoun floating around out there that means a person whose sex does not match their gender, and instead there's still sort of the assumption that you're supposed to wish that they did, and that it's not polite to act as if they didn't. So I'm not sure a single pronoun would ever. I just tell people they're all wrong, and I'm not picking. But I kind of like the suggestion of a neutral one that everyone could use, because there's really no purpose in an ordinary conversation of feeling like you have to emphasize that portion of who a person is every time you speak of them in a sentence.
Something that I've been trying to keep in mind, to not mistake people's pronouns, is just to say people's names and leave all the rest out. I don't know if that's helpful, but last question, unless anyone else has any. What was it that gave you the courage to come out?
I'm not sure it's the right question. For most of my life, from at least third grade on, I was haunted by the notion that maybe there was something wrong with me, and that the thing that was wrong with me explained why people didn't like me, and that I wasn't popular, and that I didn't have very many friends, and that I was the butt of jokes and the target of ridicule, and also violence and stuff. The act of coming out to myself was basically the result of really facing my worst fears, which are again described in the book, which is not so much the fear that I was secretly attracted to male people, or that I secretly wanted to convert my body to female, but rather that heterosexuality was not going to be a possibility for a person like me, that a person like me would never be found sexually attractive to female people, that I didn't send out the right signals to be sexy to a female person, that I was too much like them, that wasn't doing the masculinity thing. So once I realized that was what had been haunting me and really stared at it head on, I realized I can't keep running from this being who I am. I'm not going to let that fear stop me any further. I am who I am. So rather than it taking a lot of courage to come out, it took a lot of courage, I guess, to look into myself and look at the things I was the most scared of. But coming out was this great, joyous, liberating thing. It was required very little courage. It was just a moment of unbridled glee. It was practically giggling and capering in the streets. So it was a lot of fun.
That's so wonderful. That's awesome. Marie Velasco says, Allan, I appreciate you sharing your life with us. And I do too, Allan. Thank you so much. Do you have time for one more question before we close?
I do.
Okay. This last question, it says, does your identity play a lot in your experience in the publishing world?
Well, this is the only book I've ever published, and it's entirely about this. So I don't really have a presence in the publishing world that isn't very much dominated by these questions. That's not entirely true, I guess. I have a second book that has been picked up for publication. It's called That Guy in Our Women's Studies class. It's not out yet, though. Most of what I do in most contexts is at least to some degree shaped by this difference. I may not think about it consciously all the time. Let's see another question. What are you most encouraged by with these new generations of gender revolutions, new ways that we identify ourselves? What are you hoping for people who benefit from your bravery in the future? The more that people listen to the voices that are out there, the more they can stand on the proverbial shoulders of the people who've already spoken, and say, I'm not any of those things that you've already heard about. I'm this other thing that you haven't heard about yet. It would have been hard for people to explain being transsexual in a world that had no understanding yet of gay and lesbian people. Um, and then once you had that, an awareness of transsexual people, having people say like that, except that my gender identity is valid even if I don't seek hormones in an operation. And people go, oh, well, since I understood this, now I can understand this other thing too. It's easier. And now, gender fluid people and people that identify as demigirls and demi-boys and gender people and demi-romantic people and all kinds of things. And I know some people are thinking, what are they going to come up with next? But it's precisely because there's always some people out there that are not just an exception to the rule, they're an exception to the exception to the exception to the exception to the rule. And it's very difficult to explain themselves if they can't start with something that you do understand and then sort of move from there. So the wider orchestra of people participating in the LGBTQIA community, as well as the feminist community, and explaining all this, I think creates more room for yet more voices to come behind them.
Thank you, Allan. Is there anything else you want to share before I close this out? Oh.
Not that I can think of. Well, there's a lot of diversity, and sometimes there's a lot of rancor, I guess you could say, within these same communities that I've been speaking of. Oftentimes, because people are angry and they're radical, that they can become very intolerant of somebody expressing things that appears to contradict what they consider their community to have established. Within the trans community, for example, I've actually been kicked out of a handful of trans communities, groups on Facebook, because I'll express something in terms of saying I identify as male because of the, specific physical parts that my mom's obstetrician saw and wrote down male as a consequence of, and I regard those as meaning I'm male. And they say, you shouldn't say that because you saying that means you're saying I'm male if I have those parts. And listen, honey, I ain't never been male. And you're like one of those trans exclusive radical feminists, and we don't want you in here. And people will sometimes put me out of groups because it's upsetting to enough of the other people, the regulars who were already in that group before I came in, who don't want to read things like that. And it's not the line that they're used to hearing.
Mm-hmm.
But in some ways, we're like the proverbial blind men, each touching a little portion of the elephant and getting into arguments and not realizing we're really talking about the same complex phenomenon. What each of us as activists needs to realize that what validates me and folks like me isn't necessarily universally liberationist. The things that validate me may make somebody else feel oppressed, and we shouldn't assume, well, then they're just wrong and they're the enemy. Not everything that appears to contradict my experience is necessarily oppressive, but we need to get past the I hate to use the term cancel culture because a lot of the people that use that term are using it as a buzzword to try to shut down all activist discussion. But I know what they mean, though. And a certain intolerance to anyone who's not passing all of the litmus tests of using the right phrases in the right order doesn't make for a safe environment. It just makes for a very homogenous one.
Yeah. We have lots of thank you. Thank you for sharing with us. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to hear your story. Paul says, not a question, just a comment. Thank you, Allan, for opening your heart with us. As a gay man who identifies as cisgender, I appreciate your journey and your openness. Much love to you.
Thank you.
Oh,
Really?
oh, we have a question if this is recorded.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, we are recording this. This will be available to view anytime after. We'll post it later tomorrow on the Santa Fe Public Library YouTube channel. So you can search for our Santa Fe Public Library's YouTube page, or look for Allan Hunter Genderqueer. I'm sure it'll come up in the videos there. Thank you everyone for being with us. Thank you, Allan, for everything. I'm so grateful to have you speak with us and share your story and your journey. And I wish you all the best in life.
Thank you.
Everyone learn more about Allan at genderkitten.com. You'll find all the links you need there to find Genderqueer, a story from a different closet, for purchase there. I purchased it as a Kindle book and blew through it. I finished it today before the program. It's wonderful, and I encourage everyone to read it. Thank you to the Friends of the Santa Fe Public Library for sponsoring this event. Be sure to check out Santa Fe Public Library's calendar for more virtual upcoming events. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Allan. Everyone stay safe, read books, and have a great night.
Thanks again.